Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox Recording here, and welcome to Viewer Questions Answered, Episode 2. Okay, so without wasting any time, let's dive right into these great group of questions. Our first question is from Denny. What's your preference of guitar pickups for metal and also for leads? Brand, model, active, or passive? Also, I like to watch you in the automation phase of the mix. That would be super cool. For example, riding the volume up on your master fader on the downbeats of choruses for more impact. I saw this in your guide for better heavy mixes, and I'd love to see how you do this. Well, Denny, thanks for your question, and I'll definitely have some videos coming out in the near future where I address some of my favorite automation tricks. So be sure to stay tuned for that. Now, on the topic of guitar pickups, I just want to say this. I'm a guitar player, and I used to obsess over pickups before I got into production. So when I was a kid and I was just a guitar player playing in bands, I'd be swapping out pickups every other day within my guitars. Now this is back before bare knuckle pickups and all these fancy pants pickups that exist today. I pretty much would obsess between EMGs, Seymour Duncans, DiMarzios, the OG style pickups. And yes, there were differences between these different pickups. Obviously some were higher output, some were lower output. EMGs are much more compressed and much hotter than passive pickups, so there is a difference. Now me as a guitar player, I actually prefer passive pickups over active pickups. I feel they're generally a little warmer, a little cleaner, and a lot more of the personality of the actual wood of the guitar can shine through a little more easily, at least in my experience. Now with that being said, when it comes to my productions and working with bands, I honestly don't care much about pickup selection. Again, there is a difference, but there are much more important things to pay attention to throughout the duration of a production. And when it comes to guitar tone, I would say that cabinet selection, mic placement, and paying attention to the performance is infinitely more important than the actual pickups that you're using. And if you're not using a real live tube amp, the IR makes a massive difference. I cannot emphasize enough how important impulse responses are to your resulting guitar tone. They are much more important than the pickup you're using, believe me. And in case you haven't downloaded my custom impulse response of my favorite Mesa Boogie cabinet out of my studio, there's a link below in this video's description where you could download it for absolutely free. So if you haven't done that, be sure to do it. Now I can kind of understand how people obsess over this. If you just look at a DI track coming from an EMG pickup versus a DI track coming from, let's say, a Seymour Duncan or a lower output pickup, the waveform will be squashed and lopped off. And this is because EMGs are super hot. But like I said, there are much more important things to pay attention to. And also I just try to find a pickup that works great for rhythms and leads. And honestly, most these days work great for both. So my take on it is that yes, guitar pickups are fun. There are subtle differences between the different makes and models, but it's not something I really obsess over because it's not gonna make a difference within my productions. Excellent question. Okay, our next question comes from Martin. Would you prefer a GAP Pre-73 instead of a digital Neve emulation when recording vocals or a mic'd guitar cab? Do you prefer digital emulations to analog budget emulation, generally speaking? Thanks for your excellent videos. Cheers from Copenhagen. Okay, Martin, thanks for your question, and I have my own take on this. Me personally, I don't worry too much about what preamp I'm using or what plugin emulation I'm using, because I found throughout the years, much like with guitar pickups, it's much more important to focus on big picture things when it comes to your productions. So for example, I don't worry about using transformer-based preamps. I record my sources clean through like a clean preamp, which pretty much most people have within their budget interfaces, and I add color intentionally within the mixing phase. Now this is also a slippery slope because many people obsess over what plugin emulation they're using, and honestly man, I really don't think about it much. Sometimes I'll use the stock saturators in my DAW, sometimes I'll use a plugin from Slate or Waves, and recently I've been really digging the plugins from a company called Sonomus. I think they make great tools for a very affordable price. But again, when I sit down in the mix, I don't obsess over which one I'm gonna use because at the end of the day, what's really gonna make the big difference are your EQ moves, your general balance, panning, and making sure that you're just mixing for the song and help bringing the artist's vision to life. I could say with 100% certainty that if I'm using analog modeler A versus analog modeler B, that should not impact my production. The things I just mentioned previously are what really are gonna impact my production most. So to sum your question all up In a nutshell, yes, I do prefer digital emulations over hardware because I feel they sound just as good as the real thing these days, and they have for a very long time now. But even within the digital domain, I don't obsess over which tools I'm using. I tend to stick with the tools I know best and have been using for a long time because I can work much more efficiently and the gear is not in my mind at all. I'm in a constant state of flow while I'm mixing. Now, I do introduce new tools into my arsenal from time to time. Like for example, I'm really digging these new Sonomus plugins, but I'll only do so if they're really helping my workflow. Excellent question. Okay, and our next question here comes from Nick. I've been doing audio for many years and only ever recorded myself. I do feel I'm ready to mix other bands' music, but I have no idea where to start. Do I advertise? With no bands playing, I can't go to shows and network. Where's a good starting point? Thanks. Nick, that's an excellent question because we are living through very, very unique times right now. And you are right, there are no shows happening, so it's hard to network with bands in person. But with that being said, I've made great relationships with bands without ever meeting them simply through the internet or social media or plain old email. So what I recommend during this time where we're all kind of stuck at home for the most part is form relationships in some way with a band you really dig, even if it's through DMs on social media. Much like I mentioned last week, it's very important to form relationships and to maybe offer a free mix to a band that's really talented and you really dig. So for example, let's say there's a band you've been following for a while on Instagram or Facebook, and you know they're currently recording, but you're not sure if they have a mix engineer picked out yet. Simply hit them up, tell them you're a fan of their work, send them a portfolio of some of your best work, and mention to them that you'd love to do a free single for them. The great thing about this is that you're cutting through all the clutter and you're not working with bands that are gonna waste your time. Now, even if this doesn't lead to paid work for you right off the bat, what you're doing is you're planting seeds and forming solid relationships with real people. So that would be my best piece of advice here. So just form relationships and offer maybe a free single, nothing crazy. Don't offer like a free album, but a free mix for one song with a band that you know is talented and not messing around. I hope that helps and keep me posted on how that works out. Okay, our next question comes from Michael Myers and he wrote a bunch of stuff here, but I'll sum it up in a nutshell what he's asking. Okay, so Mr. Myers here is pretty much asking about recording DIs, having your guitar tone translate onto playback systems like playback systems outside of your studio, and also how to get bass to cut through, meaning bass guitar, to cut through a mix without being too loud or too low. Now, Mr. Myers, the first thing I want to say here when it comes to your DI recording, it seems that you might be overthinking the process just a little. You mentioned having issues with your bass response because of your DI track, but to me that sounds more like a problem with the impulse response you're using. Now, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but it's really true. People often overcomplicate the whole recording DIs thing, but it's actually really simple. I don't care if you're using the cheapest amp sim on earth. If you're using a quality impulse response, your tone will sound just as good as a real amp. I know because I record with tube amps simply for fun all the time. So if you find that you have to constantly be messing with the low end of your guitars and that they're not translating to your stereo systems, it's probably your impulse response. It's not that you're recording your DIs too hot or anything overly complicated like that. It usually at the end of the day ends up being something very, very simple, assuming your performances are tight and everything is well edited. Now, as far as your guitar tones translating properly to other playback system, again, that kind of falls into the category of keeping it simple. If you have a great performance played on a guitar with relatively new strings and everything is nice and tight performance-wise, and you're using an amp sim with a decent impulse response or with a real amp and a proper mic placement on a good sounding cab, your guitar should not sound night and day between different playback systems. Just remember to roll off the super duper low end on a guitar, pretty much anything below 70 Hertz and anything above 12K. The extreme lows and highs you don't need on guitar tracks, not even rhythm guitar tracks. Now, as far as helping bass cut through the mix, it's all about a nice mid-range. And my favorite trick in the book is to blend in a bandpass version of my bass DI, slightly distorted, to help my bass cut through in a dense mix and also help my bass be heard a little on smaller speakers. I'll leave a link below to one of my tutorials within this video's description where I show you my favorite technique for getting bass to cut through. Believe me, I know the struggle. When you can't hear your bass, it's tempting to just turn it up, but then when you bring your mix out to your car, your mix is completely muddy. And again, I find the simple trick that I just mentioned really helps in most cases, especially with heavy music. So Michael Myers, thank you for your question. Okay, our next question comes from Frank. Hey Bobby, I've got a question for you. What are your reference tracks for mixing? Always good to hear what other people use. One of my favorites is Morgan by Children of Bodom. Cheers from the Netherlands, Frank. Well, Frank, thanks for asking. Now these days, I use reference tracks in a slightly different way than I used to. For example, right now I'm mixing a record for a band called Windfarer. And what I always do with the band is I mix the first song and make sure it's approved by the entire band. So then I know that that song will be the reference for the rest of the album. So once I nail the first song, I'll have it in my session and regularly A/B it when I get towards the end of the mix of the song that I'm currently working on to make sure it's gelling properly with that first song, that initial song that the band agreed on. But with that being said, there are a few reference tracks that I've been using for many, many years, although not as often now, but I've been using them for many years nonetheless. The first is track 9 off of the Accept album, Blood of the Nations, I think it's called. Blood of Nations? Blood of the Nations. I think it's Blood of the Nations. Now, if you've ever watched any of my videos, you probably know by now that I'm a huge Andy Sneap fan, and Andy Sneap mixed this album completely in the box, and it is a phenomenal sounding record. It's huge, big, fat, and wide, and not compressed. Nice and hot, but not too hot. Very well balanced. So if I'm working on a production where I'm going for that extra wide, natural, organic sound, I'll often compare my final mix to that song. And again, it's track 9 off that album. I don't know the name of the song, actually. I've been using that track for years and I still don't know the name of the song. But again, track 9 off of Accept's Blood of the Nations. Another reference track that I used to use, although not as much anymore, is a song off of a Breaking Benjamin album. I couldn't think of the name of the band for a second. And it was mixed by Dan Korneff, who's a phenomenal mixer. So if I'm working on a track that's a little poppier, where the artist wants a super loud and more compressed sounding mix, I'll often compare my final mix to that track. I don't remember what track it is, but it's off the album, I think Dear Agony it's called. So Breaking Benjamin's Dear Agony. Again, it's nice and hot, a little more compressed than the Accept record, but still not compressed and very nice, lush, and analog sounding. Love the sound of that album. So Frank, thanks again for your question. Okay, our final question here comes from Alexi. Now, Alexi wrote a very thorough question here, but I'll sum it up for you. He's asking if, let's say for example, a band hires you to mix their album and ends up not being satisfied with your mix. And no matter how many mix revisions you do, they're still not satisfied and you're spending a ton of time, too much time, on this particular project. How do you go about that situation? Now, Alexi, thank you for asking this question because it is an excellent question and I think it will really help benefit people when they hear my advice on this topic. So here's the thing that's tricky about production and what we do as engineers and producers in general. It's very subjective. In other words, some people love one engineer's work, while other people might think it sounds like crap and love this engineer's work. Even within the metal genre. For example, I'm a huge Andy Sneap fan. And then there are guys that are fans of more modern engineers, like let's say Joey Sturgis. Two very, very different sounding producers and engineers with very different production styles. Some might hate one's production and dig the other's and vice versa. Now, there's a very specific reason why I'm bringing this fact up. I always make sure when a band hires me that they're hiring me because they like my work. If a band sends me an email asking me to mix their project and they mention that they want the mix to sound like, I don't know, Joey Sturgis or Chris Lord-Alge, I'll immediately tell them to not hire me and to hire someone that has that type of style. Now, I don't mean this in a negative way. I just know from firsthand experience that when you try to sound like someone else, it doesn't work. Everyone has a slightly different style and hears music in a slightly different way and has their own specific tastes. Now, if a band contacts me and says, I really like the sound that you produced on this record you did, we're going for something similar to that, that's a different story. That means they're going for me because of my sound. Now, in order to stop projects from going on and on and on and on, it's very important to have some form of limitation when it comes to your projects, whether it's a time limitation or maybe a revision limitation. For example, when a band hires me to mix their project, I allow for 3 revisions. And it's amazing, when a band hires me to do their mix and they know they only have 3 revisions, lo and behold, the record gets done, everyone's happy, and I don't have to deal with endless mix notes most of the time. So Alexi, this was an excellent question, and that's pretty much how most professionals handle it. They, number one, make sure that they're the right fit for the band, and they don't take on a project or an artist that's revealing a lot of red flags. And number 2, they have some form of limitation on their services in terms of time. Because believe me, there are artists out there that will literally make you mix a song a million times. I've been there. And it's very difficult to run a successful business if you're constantly bombarded with mix notes that don't end. So Lexi, thanks again. Hopefully that helps you and answers your question. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed this second episode of Viewer Questions Answered. And again, if you send me a question and I haven't gotten to it yet, I definitely will within one of these upcoming videos within this series. So be patient, I'll get to it. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of our weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. You can both like and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the description below. And again, you could download my custom guitar impulse response for absolutely free. There's a link below in this video's description. Download the IR, load it into your favorite amps and plug it and get right to dialing in killer metal guitar tone with absolute ease. Till next time, happy mixing.